Okay, let's make a start, and then people can join us as in the next few minutes as they register. Welcome everybody to this webinar. This is a webinar that's part of the topic advisory group on enabling transitions to net zero within the Lunds Hub. And this focus today is looking at literacies and building capacity for net zero across the whole of the agricultural knowledge system, not just farmers, but advisors, rural communities and supply chain intermediaries as well. And we've got an excellent list of four speakers today. I'll let them introduce themselves in detail when they come to speak. But I think we're going to have a great range of experiences to be presented, so I'm looking forward to it. The format will be about 15 or 20 minutes per presentation, some clarification questions afterwards, and then after the three presentations, we'll have an opportunity for about half an hour or so of discussion. And just to say that this is being recorded, so just so you know that, and hopefully once the recording's finished and processed, it will go on the Lunds Hub and will be accessible there, so you can share it with anybody who happened to miss it. Great. Okay, so let's start off with Brady Stevens and Sarah Erbanova, who are consultants who work at SAC Consulting in the food and footprint team. And today they're going to be talking about experiences delivering carbon literacy training for rural industries. So I'll hand over straight away to you, Brady and Sarah, to introduce yourselves, and the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Julie. You seeing those slides all right?
We are, yeah, that's all good.
Great. Nice to see everybody. Thanks very much for joining. I'm Brady Stevens. I've been at SAC for 4 years now. As Julie said, Sarah and I sit within the food and footprint team, which is a specialist team working right across Scotland, including on this topic. In terms of net zero literacy, my personal experience, I've delivered our carbon literacy for rural industries training. I've delivered some trainings for BASIS on climate and carbon targeted towards agricultural advisors, but a lot of my other work at SAC involves climate, environment, and social research, doing stakeholder engagement to inform and refine government policies. Sarah.
Hi everyone, my name is Sarah Erbanova, and yeah, I work with Brady. I've been with SAC Consulting just like longer than Brady, just over 4 years. My background is in sustainable environmental management, and then with SAC Consulting, I've been working on various sort of carbon management projects, carbon management and net zero plans for agriculture, as well as retailers or small and medium enterprises. And I've co-developed our carbon literacy training that I'll be talking about shortly. And I'm also part of Climate Smart Advisors project, which is an EU project that I will also touch on later.
So today we're gonna walk through a bit about SAC and SRUC for any who are less familiar with the organization. We'll talk about our experience in delivering carbon literacy training, as well as a recent project around Scotland's agricultural knowledge and innovation system, which has a lot of links to this topic. And then we'll end on a little reflection on our part in the EU Climate Smart Advisors Network. So first up, a bit about SAC. We are part of Scotland's Rural College, SRUC, where we seek to combine our 3 pillars of research, education, and consulting. We are the home of AgriCalc, one of the leading farm carbon auditing tools in the UK. And so our spread is right across Scotland. We have a network of 25 local offices, giving us that sort of local footprint across the different farming regions of Scotland. In terms of LUNs, myself and a few colleagues across SRUC are inputting and helping to coordinate the Scotland national team and their input into the LUNs hub. This is just a diagram that gives an overview of the team within SAC that Sarah and I are a part of, called Food and Footprint. So beyond Sarah and myself, we have a wide variety of specialisms in the team, which cover the different areas on the screen here. When I was reflecting a bit on this and coming into today's presentation, looking at the different things that we do in our team, it all pretty much boils down to different types of data and knowledge and providing that to businesses to drive wise and sustainable decisions. This underlies the theme of today's presentation that net zero literacy and engagement is really at the core of what we do as a team. So I'm now going to hand over to Sarah to talk a bit more about carbon literacy training in depth.
Sure. Thank you, Brady. Carbon literacy for rural industries is a training course that we've designed to, as it says on the screen, basically level the playing field for the just transition. So before going into detail about the training itself, I thought it would be good to kind of look at this slide, which is my favorite slide that which is part of the training content. And I think it provides really good background and kind of helps us set the scene for net zero in the land use sector. I'll talk about just transition here, and just transition is basically a concept that the Scottish Government uses in the net zero strategy, and it basically means that the cost of decarbonisation is not overburdening those who can least afford it. So basically, the cost of lowering carbon emissions across the economy are kind of spread out evenly across the economy and across the society. So the vision under just transition is a fairer, greener future for all. It's more climate resilient economy. It delivers fairness and tackles inequality and justice. And part of the vision is also sustainable land use and regenerative agriculture. So as you can see, really nice vision, a fairly straightforward, probably many of us can get on board with that, but you can also tell it's very ambitious. So going to the next part of what I think, is important to acknowledge is the challenge, is that land use and agriculture have an essential role in Scotland's net zero. So just like all the other sectors in the economy, land use also is required to reduce emissions in line with the national targets to achieve net zero. So that's the same, for land use, it's the same for energy sector, for transport, for building, for industry, etc. However, under net zero, it also, land use sector specifically also needs to remove remaining carbon emissions from the atmosphere by creating carbon sinks, and that's by creation of forests and by peatland restoration mainly. So it's also expected to help all the other sectors decarbonize by creating those carbon sinks. And we also expected on top of this to increase renewable energy capacity. And again, that's not just renewable energy capacity to replace the energy that is being used by the land use sector, but to help all the other sectors decarbonize. So this is what we expect and require from land use sector under the Net Zero Scotland. But we can't forget that we also expect it to continue delivering on what it has always been delivering on. So we wanted to continue producing food, materials, and other resources. We needed to continue providing other services to the rural as well as urban communities. We needed to improve quality of life for the rural communities, provide fair work for the rural communities. We need the sector to make rural, coastal, and island areas more resilient. And now this is in light of climate change. We are aware that the impacts of climate change are are more apparent in the kind of rural sectors and the land use, and land use sector is really the first sector that will see the impacts. So not only it needs to decarbonize, it also needs to start implementing those adaptation measures as well to adapt to the ongoing climate change. And it also needs to continue improving natural environment for future generations. So I just wanted to kind of set the scene to kind of highlight some of the specific and unique challenges that the land use sector is faced with. And just with that, to see how important it is to kind of devise very nuanced approaches to carbon literacy and net zero literacy in the land use sector. So one of our ways that we've decided to do it is that we've designed this carbon literacy training for rural industries. This is an externally accredited training by the Carbon Literacy Project that you might have heard of or might be familiar with. We've co-designed this training with Keep Scotland Beautiful, which is a Scottish charity organisation who are carbon literacy certified. And our training course is designed specifically for agricultural, food and land-based businesses. The carbon literacy trainings, as well as our training for the rural industries, are designed to make them accessible to everyone. So no matter what your background or what your education is, everyone should be able to engage with the training content. And the aim is to help people understand what their role is in kind of net zero and in decarbonization within their workplace. So it kind of works to create this low carbon culture, something that people can easily understand, easily engage with, and integrate within their kind of day-to-day job tasks. And as such, it helps organizations embed sustainable behaviors. So when we designed the training, we really wanted to make sure that it is impactful, it's relevant to people, that it's not just us talking about, kind of climate science for too long, that people just kind of switch off and, don't really have any way to relate to it. So we've decided to make sure that people can engage with the training content by creating a sector tailored content. So as you'll be aware, land use sector is not very homogeneous. Actually, there's various different subsectors that are quite different. So you'll have your farming, agriculture, crofting, you'll have fisheries, aquaculture, tourism, game, food and drink sector. So all of these are obviously quite different, but all of these kind of businesses are very tied to land use. So we made sure that we've got kind of content that's tailored to each of those subsectors so that our content, our training is as engaging as it can be and making it as relevant as possible to the participants. This is also tied to using relevant case studies. So we always look for case studies of initiatives and projects and actions that have taken place within the subsector and as close as possible to the location where our participants are based, so that they can get inspired by the kind of decarbonization initiatives that have taken place elsewhere, and they can see what is possible to be done and what the impacts are. And again, that just makes it a little bit more relevant for people to engage with. We also encourage a lot of group discussions. This is something that our participants have really told us that, they valued the opportunity to get together in breakout rooms with their peers to discuss their experiences, their challenges, possible solutions, what has worked where, how. And this kind of peer-to-peer knowledge exchange is something that really adds value to the training course. We always make sure we use the latest data, latest news, technologies, innovations. Again, we just update our slides on regular basis and basically before every single delivery, just to make sure we are relevant for the people attending our course and worth their while. And lastly, just to touch on, we also offer bespoke training options. So we offer working with organizations who have probably who perhaps have sustainability targets or net zero targets in place, and they just need their workforce to get on board, and they need to kind of encourage these low carbon behaviors and actions. So we can also help them create their bespoke training option as well. And last bit, before I hand back to Brady, so how do we know it works? So for me personally, it's actually always been really important to understand whether this approach has worked or hasn't worked, and what has worked and what can be improved. So we put a lot of emphasis on collecting feedback and on evaluating our training delivery, and constantly kind of changing and improving to make sure that our participants see the value in the training and they get what they need from our training. So just to briefly touch on this, we do a pre-course survey as well as post-course survey, and what we try to do is measure the impact our course has had on our participants. And from the kind of snapshot that's on the slide here, you know, we are really happy to see that our participants have reported that thanks to our training, or after attending our training, they can understand the scientific basis of climate change better. They feel more confident talking about climate change to other people around them. They can identify low carbon behaviors, and they also feel more confident about talking about adopting low carbon behaviors and encouraging others. I've put in a few quotes down there on the slides there as well. I'm not going to go over these. Yeah, they just really make me happy to see that the participants have valued our training. And that's me on this, and then I'll hand to Brady.
Thanks, Sarah. Great. I'm just going to give a quick overview of a recent project we're just wrapping up on Scotland's agricultural knowledge and innovation system. I wanted to speak about this one in particular at this webinar about, in the wider tag about enabling transition, just because I find that AKIS is really central to, it is that infrastructure that allows for the spread of knowledge, which is a prerequisite for making that change. So I'll jump right in. AKIS, an agricultural knowledge and innovation system, is the sum total of all agricultural knowledge and innovation actors in a given nation. It's a concept that was developed originally in the European Union and recognizes that while farmers and practitioners are at the center, agricultural knowledge and innovation exists and can be driven by a wide range of actors and organizations. So all these different groups contribute in their own ways to driving change. And there's double-headed arrows in this diagram to signify that that flows in both directions. So this was a project we did for WWF Scotland, who saw one of their key pillars is around investing in skills and learning, and they saw AKIS as an area that they wanted to get more involved to drive positive change forward. So the research questions of our project were: what are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats of the current knowledge transfer and advisory system, and what policy and funding levers are required to develop a knowledge and advice service that supports Scottish farmers and crofters in reducing emissions, restoring nature, and maintaining food production under a new agricultural payment system. This is just an overview of the project's objectives and activities. So we did a review of kind of international AKISs overseas, and a literature review, and then we spoke to a number of people across these different types of organizations to get their views on what's working and what isn't as well. We did an exploratory workshop around unpicking some of these issues at the Royal Highland Show, and have now written it up in a report which will be launched in the coming months. So AKIS isn't always, it's not one thing. It's not always super formalized and integrated. From that first kind of diagram, you can see that there's lots of different types of organizations, and knowledge sits in many sometimes fragmented areas. So one of our project outputs was just sort of pulling that all together and giving an overview of what AKIS means in Scotland, mapping out those actors and organizations. We also were thinking about those key skills in regenerative agriculture. So we mapped out what are the most important skills, where does the knowledge sit, and then kind of joining those dots together to say where are the bottlenecks and what needs to flow better, and did a bit of a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats analysis across for specific skills and knowledge areas. So some of our key findings were, when we looked at practices in particular, a key takeaway for me was there are practices which are highest impact in terms of number, mitigation potential, but the ones that move the needle are those that practitioners are able to integrate easily and seamlessly. It's a combination of those two things that really move the needle on net zero. Scotland's AKIS is strong, but somewhat fragmented and underfunded. So there's a lot of knowledge, but it could use a bit of sort of pulling together and streamlining. Farmer and crofter confidence requires trusted advice, which I think will be a key theme of the webinar discussion today. Peer learning and demonstration farms work. Scotland could learn from Ireland's Chugask AKIS model, and high impact interventions in terms of those skills are known but under-delivered. So the evidence is there and something else is holding up implementation. So out of this project, some of our recommendations and conclusions were for ring-fence specialist advisory grants, expanding monitor farms and demonstration networks, and both of those, so allowing experts to, creating areas where experts can get directly in front of farmers, and then that's half, and then the other half is around really letting the conversations flow among practitioners and farmers and crofters, and creating spaces for that peer learning to happen. I will wrap up my bit there and hand back to Sarah to talk about climate smart advisors. Just a warning, I think we are coming to the end of our time. So
yes, I was just going to interrupt and say just a couple more minutes, please. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I'll be very quick here. It's a big project, so I could probably speak about it but much longer, but I'll just give you a very brief overview. So yeah, I've been really lucky to be able to be involved with this European project called Climate Smart Advisors, and the aims straightforward right on the screen. So the aims are to boost the European agricultural advisory community and accelerate the adoption of climate smart farming practices. So this project specifically is really focusing on farming advisors, which are kind of put front and center for the project. However, it creates this kind of AKIS network. So these are that's the Agricultural Knowledge and Innovation Systems network of researchers kind of gathering the data, the evidence, and then being able to transfer it onto the advisors, who then it's the aims are to collect this this knowledge and tools for farm advisory, which help advisors encourage farmers to adopt climate smart farming practices. So this project also aims to develop and disseminate climate smart innovations and practices across the duration, which is 7 years. We've just about completed the first 3 years of the project this spring. However, the majority of the deliverables are still in front of us, so there's still a lot to come. There are 2 sister projects that you might have heard of, which is Climate Farm Demo and Clean Farms. I'm not personally involved with either of them, but just to make you aware that these are all kind of sister projects to Climate Smart Advisors as well. And I think I'll just finish on the last slide then, before we go over time too much. I just wanted to make our audience aware that there will be an AKIS meeting in about 2 weeks' time on 18th of November in Stoneleigh Park. This meeting is hosted by our partner organization, which is Innovation for Agriculture. Excuse me. I've also provided the logos of the partner organizations that are involved with the Climate Smart Advisors at the bottom of this slide that some people might recognize. So this AKIS meeting will basically bring together agricultural professionals to kind of discuss the challenges that we're facing in the UK to kind of encourage more climate smart farming practices, what the challenges are, how we can overcome them, and what individual kind of players' roles are. So, you know, what can the research do better? What can the education, policymakers, farmers, and advisors do better to overcome these? So if anyone is interested in attending, I've put my email address right there on the screen. Feel free to drop me an email, and I can send you the kind of invite and agenda and how to register. And I also wanted to point out that there is a Climate Smart Advisors website. So if you just Google EU Climate Smart Advisors, you should be able to find the website to find more information about this project particularly. And you can also sign up to a monthly newsletter, so you'll just be updated on a regular basis on where the project is at.
Great, thank you very much. I think unless there's any burning questions at this point for clarification, we'll move on, and then we'll address the more general questions after the last talk. So should we go straight to you, Rachael? Rachael Madeley-Davies is Head of Environment / Technical at AHDB. So I'll let you introduce yourself further, Rachael.
Brilliant.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks, Julie. And it's always a relief when you go in second to understand that your sort of presentation perhaps complements what you've just heard rather than contradicts. So that's good. Except I must probably give a warning now that mine probably feels actually quite simplistic and probably almost going back to basics compared to what we've just seen. But hopefully it will all make sense. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm Rachael. So AHDB, Head of Technical. Got quite a colourful career in this space. So was previously at Hubby Cymru, Meat Promotion Wales, doing a very similar role for the Welsh Levy Board. So a bit of doing the rounds of the levy boards in the UK, but also spent a number of years as a consultant. So actually on farm, doing carbon accounting, creating mitigation programs, particularly for the livestock sector. So it is about sort of really sort of walking that walk, and also should declare quite early on, I am also a beef and sheep farmer in Wales. So again, for me, it's about walking the talk, and I think that that's really quite key. Right, I will just scoot along. Right, so my big thing, this is what I'm going to cover today, really. And mine, it's about getting the language right. And I think, you know, we're all quite used to using the language on a daily basis. And you know, I'm probably actually, your average farmer now is using language they just weren't using 10 years ago on a daily basis, if not a weekly basis. So I think it's really key that we're going to talk about getting the language right. Now, I'm a big fan about in terms of really sort of busting the myths that we're hearing quite a lot in the carbon space, and I think that's really fundamental, so farmers start to know actually what can they believe or what can they believe. And I think, as we just heard, I think, you know, I thought you mentioned trusted sources and trusted advice, and it's really key that we start to break down some of those barriers. And the big thing for me as well would always be, from a farm perspective, actually, what's in it for me? You know, actually, what does this mean and why should I care? And I think that's how we then start to really build that sort of literacy and sort of capability. So, right, I'm just going to scoot along. And I warn you now, I'm quite a no-frills girl in terms of slides, so I haven't got that many, but hopefully it will stimulate some questions that we can then bring out in the panel session afterwards. Right, so first of all, if we talk about language, if my slides will move along, here we go. Right, these are some headlines. This is actually from COP26 now, so a few years back, but these are big global headlines. And I think for me, it's remembering that the language is really quite inflammatory in this space. And actually farmers are probably getting it from all sort of angles in terms of what they need to do on farm, that they need to transform and they need to transition, which actually is quite challenging in its own. So if you think about in the language about transformation, that's bold. It's suggesting that everything you're doing now is wrong. And actually some of the language that we see around the whole climate space can be really quite inflammatory, can be quite scary, I think, both from a farmer but also from a human perspective. So there were just some headlines. Here's some more. So this is these are headlines that came from the IPCC's 6th assessment a few years back now. And again, I think it's remembering this is the dialogue, this is the background more broadly around climate change. And I think it's always, for me, it's always about then how we translate that in terms of how our farming systems here, can be can improve, but also can be part of the solution for this. So I think for me, it's really important that we start to think about the broader context, the global context in terms of language and sensation in this space, and actually then what it means when we're discussing, with farmers in terms of actually what they can do on farm. Now, this is a rather pathetic attempt that I try to do, a sort of word cloud through Copilot. Copilot's is a bit jittery, but I think you get the idea. And I think this goes back to my point that actually, as farmers, as food producers, as land managers, there's lots of things we're always juggling. I think that's really key, from being our own sort of perhaps animal health and nutrition expert, from being an accountant, from being the HR director. And now actually we've got this whole new space for farmers. And as I said, we'll find you don't need to go very far in terms of a farmer meeting or even down the market somewhere. And actually some of this language is being used, on a daily basis. And I think for me, it's about sometimes understanding, keeping the language really simple. And actually, what does that mean? And sometimes actually, what does that mean perhaps in more than one context for farmers as well? And so for me, it's been really conscious in terms of the advice we're giving, in terms of any information that's being disseminated, that actually we ensure that the language remains simple, but actually that there's a two-way understanding, because sometimes one thing might mean one thing to someone and quite a different thing to another. So for me, it's all about keeping it really straight and simple, and actually remembering what that looks like on farm as well. I think that's key. It's that translation between that sort of particularly perhaps sometimes research and actually the farm level, and what that looks like at farm level in terms of sort of language. Right, myths. Now, I think most of us probably, if we'd had £1 for every time we've probably heard at least one of these, we'd be quite rich. We'd probably be retiring quite soon. And these are 5 sort of, I think, quite common myths that we hear about. And for me, I do think as an industry, we do still need quite a lot of sort of open leadership in terms of really starting to break down some of those common myths we have. And I think because at the minute, I think, myths, and when they rise, and we know that we have different triggers sometimes, some of these will trigger at different times according perhaps what's happening in the press or what someone's shouting about at the moment, is they become a barrier for change. They can become a barrier for engagement. So for me, it's about being really sort of open and honest in terms of actually, net zero, that's a prime example in terms of actually really sort of drumming home actually what is meant by net zero, the fact that it does not mean zero emissions. And I think that goes forgotten. I think sometimes perhaps you could even argue that some of these myths, they extend beyond the farm gate as well in terms of that lack of understanding. And it goes to the point where perhaps people are using language that they weren't using before, but perhaps they don't necessarily understand fully what that means. So again, I think for me, it's about really trying to break down some of these key myths. And, we can think of a real clear sort of way of breaking down every single one of these. And I think what we need to be conscious of is that, that there are voices that perhaps sometimes utilize some of these myths for advantage. And all these myths, every single one of them here, actually are a big limiting factor in terms of how farmers can progress, change, can be part of their solution, and can continue to produce nutritious, sustainable food alongside delivering for, both climate and for nature. And I think it's really fundamental that, along with the right language, clear, concise, understanding what it means to the farmers, that we start to combat and break down some of the myths that circulate through our industry today. Right, so what's in it for me? And I think this is it. It's remembering that once you've got the language right, once you've then demystified things and you've broken down some of those untruths, it means then that you're starting to have that engagement piece with farmers. And then it's a point actually, why should I do these things? Actually, what is in it for me? How does that benefit my business? And I think, having spent a number of years undertaking sort of carbon calculations of farms, it's actually, actually that number, that figure is less relevant to them. It's actually, what does it mean for their business? And I think for me, it's about having real consideration in terms of, exactly what is meant by those numbers. Does it matter? How it matters? But also then it's about what comes next. And I think that's the key. Sometimes it's understanding actually it's not necessarily good or bad, but actually what do they need to do as a result of that sort of output in terms of their carbon footprint, for example. So for me, it's very much about giving bespoke, and I know, thankfully we've just heard in the previous presentation about that sort of advice, and it's really quite key that we are talking about specifics on farm here. We're not giving generic things, and I think nothing switches you off more as a farmer than someone coming on and actually telling you to do something that actually will not work for your farm. And I think it's really key that we need to understand that we're so fortunate in the UK that we're a complete patchwork of different farming systems, a patchwork of different landscapes, and actually we need to really sort of tailor advice to that, where we're talking about specifics and actually what that farmer needs to do on their farm that suits them as an individual, but also suits their farm and will also fundamentally deliver change, rather than giving generic sort of solutions. I'm always a big fan of also where we start to really understand, perhaps, and this is very much goes back to the specifics point, is where we understand the sort of the consequences or the unintended consequences of certain actions. And again, that's where we've got to really, we don't want to be chucking the baby out with the bathwater because we're hell-bent on one thing. We've got to think of things more holistically. We've also got to think actually how they impact that farm and what the benefits will be. So this is very much about tailored initiatives, tailored for that farm, but also understanding the broader sort of landscape. And I think from a farmer perspective, it's always really important to understand actually how practical things are. Can that actually be done? And sometimes I don't just mean practical in terms of perhaps capability or skills. I mean, are there planning restrictions? Are there designation restrictions? And again, it goes back to being really specific. It's about understanding the bigger picture and how that fits in to this whole agenda. And obviously cost. I think it sometimes, I think in terms of greenhouse gas mitigation, sometimes at farm level we forget that ultimately some things can come at a cost. Obviously we know from the work through Max that actually there are win-wins too, and they're a really good sort of starting point, but ultimately there will be costs sometimes short term, but it's really key to understand. So for me, it's about making sure when we talk about what's in it for me from a farmer perspective, that that farmers don't get sort of different versions of the truth, that they have clear sort of clarity in terms of what it means for them, and that they understand the impact both in terms of their product, their enterprise, and also their farm. And I think that's quite key. Right, my final slide, I'll be glad to hear, is and this is it. Sometimes what's in it for me, it's also about thinking about what are the sort of the shared goals, and I think that's really key. And I think from an engagement piece, it's thinking about what are those sort of co-benefits of some of these changes. So once you've got the language right, you've demystified it, actually, what's in it for me? What are the win-wins? What are the no regrets decisions? And I think that's really quite key in terms of demonstrating actually, that we know that a number of mitigation factors will also they correlate with farm profitability, they correlate with climate adaptation. Actually, there's multiple benefits from doing some of these actions. And I think that's really powerful from a farm level, that you'll know that you're doing something for multiple benefits rather than just one, particularly if you're less engaged with perhaps climate change. Now, I always think, and this is particularly sort of key, I think, in this area at the moment, is this whole concept about encouraging questions and not promising certainty. This whole space, we need to be really open and honest. It's rapidly developing in terms of research, in terms of science. We also need to sort of remember that actually we are dealing with estimates all the time, sort of in terms of greenhouse gas accounting. It's estimates of estimates. And I think sometimes it's about understanding this is part of a journey, I think, for farm, and I think that's really quite key. I think my sort of last points, and they probably related quite nicely to what we heard in the previous presentation, is actually it's about really sort of utilising farmer voices. You wouldn't believe how many things I go to, and sometimes I think, where's the farmer on the panel? And I think sometimes it really is about engaging farmers with farmers. We like to learn from other farmers. Peer-to-peer learning is really fundamental. The use of demonstration farms and networks is really key, because actually if it can work on Bob's farm, it might work on my farm. And I think the use of sort of local trials via demonstration networks is really quite vital. So I think for me, that would be if you remember one thing I've said, I think it's remember involve farmers and actually learn that they love to learn from each other as well. Thank you very much.
Splendid. Thank you, Rachel. That was great to have the farmer's perspective, and as you said, really complemented the first talk as well. Have any clarification questions before we move on to the next talk? Yeah. Please add any questions or comments in the chat that you want us to discuss later as well. Oh, okay. Meanwhile, we'll go on to Julie Finch, who's Agriculture Governance and Compliance Manager at KEPAC. And I'll leave you, Julie, to introduce yourself and what KEPAC does in more detail. Over to you.
All right. Well, thank you and good afternoon, everybody. So, yes, I'm Julie Finch. I'm our Agriculture Governance and Compliance Manager, and my background is in animal health, genetics and breeding. And then over the last 12 to 15 years, very much how they applied to building sustainable farming systems. Now, I've been asked to give you all this afternoon a processor perspective on the topic we're discussing. And I think you'll find that there's some very common themes within this, but just so that you can see the context and where we're coming from with this, then let me just introduce KEPAC to you a little bit for those of you who aren't familiar. So we're a family-owned business. They started over in Ireland back in the 1960s and moved into the UK about 7 years ago now. We primarily process beef and lamb, and we only have one pork processing site in Ireland. So everything we do is very much focused on beef and sheep farmers. And we very much pride ourselves in trying to add value to the meat that we source and that we provide to our customers. And in terms of that, other than the fresh meat that you'd expect to see on your supermarket counters and other, we also supply a number of food service and consumer foods businesses. So very much looking at the types of meat that you probably find in ready meals, in pies, in pasties, and other novel ways of enjoying meat that you eat. And for those of you who might have come across it, the Rustler's microwavable ready meals are a KEPAC home brand. So there's a whole range of products that we supply and a wide range of customers that we service. And the reason I show you this slide is really to emphasize the range of customers and the type of customers that we as a processor deal with. And as many of you around this webinar virtual table will recognize, a lot of these customers have their own net zero ambitions and their own ideas of how they expect themselves and their suppliers to get there. So in terms of how we support those supply those customers then, we have 3 main processing sites in the UK, one up in Aberdeenshire in Scotland, one in South Wales in Merthyr Tydfil, and one in England in Cornwall. So we operate across all 3 regional jurisdictions and the challenges that also brings. And we're regularly working on an annual basis with around 3,500 farmers. They're all farm assured. And over a year, we probably process in the region of about 250,000 cattle and 500,000 lambs. And we're looking there at about, as I've got on that slide, 5,000 cattle a week and about 10,000 lambs per week, every week, 52 weeks of the year. So you can probably gather we're in contact with livestock farmers a lot. But having seen the range of customers and the number of farmers we deal with, you can probably appreciate that being a processor is a bit like being that piggy in the middle. It is a really difficult space to be. Years ago, customers were mainly interested in the health and welfare of the livestock that had produced the meat, the weights, and the conformation of the carcass that would give them the cuts of meat that they want for their dishes or for the shelves. Now, nearly all the questions we get are about how is your meat sustainably sourced and where are your farmers on that route towards net zero. They want to be able to make robust claims on their packing and in their public statements. They want it to be evidence-based and they want it to operate across the whole supply chain. And then, of course, coming back to a lot of Rachel's points, from the farmer side then, they're going, what more do we need to do? This is more paperwork. It's more data burden on us. And I think this has come through a little bit from what you've heard so far already as well. We're getting multiple asks of our farmers, and sometimes even the same ask isn't being asked in the same way. So the answer isn't the same, or they're wanting the data in a different format or whatever. It's hard for the farmer. It's hard for the customers. It's very, very hard sitting in the middle, I can assure you. So building on what Rachel's been saying, in our experience, most farmers that we're dealing with are very knowledgeable. They understand about the environmental sustainability of their farms. They understand the route to net zero. And for once, all that we're asking them to do in terms of reducing emissions, in terms of productivity, efficiency, how they manage their grasslands and so on, it's a win-win, because what will make their business more efficient and more profitable will also benefit the environment and hopefully move us down on that journey towards net zero. And in fairness, some of the farmers that we deal with, depending what tool they use, are already claiming that they're net zero, whereas others are much further behind on that journey. So as Rachel said, there is a lot of confusion out there about what tool they should use. I've used this tool one day, or I've worked with a group of farmers on a project and I got completely different results. I don't know which one to go. Oh, bother it. I'll wait and see what happens with policy or other in a few years' time. So it's creating inertia amongst some farmers. So that conflicting messages and advice, we really do have to get around that. And of course, farmers are also navigating these regional policy differences. So if you've got one farm on the border, one country's probably got different regulatory and environmental asks than a neighbouring farm that could be on the other side of a border. I'm picking up a little bit on what Rachel said earlier. There is no one size fits all, but we seem to expect all the farmers to follow the same path and do the same thing. So what does a farmer do? And a lot of it is how we translate some of that information and the data that they have. So if we're going to have meat in a net zero world, in our view, we need that whole supply chain involvement. And probably the bullet point I'm missing on this slide is the engagement with all of you on this call, all of the supporting sectors around it that are supporting and advising and researching what we need to do to get there. And possibly some of the literacy that we need is not just with our farmers, but we also need it with our customers and the government, because personnel change very quickly across the industry and that knowledge is gone. So we're constantly finding we're almost reiterating and re-educating some of our customers as well. So what do we do if we're going to try and build that capacity even further towards net zero? Yes, work together where we can. If we can get those consistent messages and harmonise an approach, that would help. There's also been a lot of investment by organisations and companies in specific tools and approaches that they hope might accelerate their progress. And we won't get away from that. But the key is demonstrating the progress. And as I say, we've got some farms which are already well on this journey because inherently they've been making their businesses more efficient, more sustainable over the years. So there isn't a great deal more wiggle room that they've got to be able to go any further. And yet, are we asking them now to go even further? And if so, how? And there's some farms that, because of their location, maybe the underlying soil geology and what have you, maybe they'll never quite reach net zero. But the whole point is we need everybody in this so that the overall industry achieves net zero. And by doing, if we can demonstrate our progress, we can almost also demonstrate our strength, which again, I think comes back to a point that Rachael might have made, that it is very difficult to get that data that we've been talking about from a farm, from a supply chain, from England or Wales or Scotland, and trying to pull it together to get a UK view is even harder, so that we can not so much defend ourselves. We always end up being very, very defensive, but demonstrate actually how good we are at some of this if we don't have the UK data. And I can say this as the current chair of the UK Cattle Sustainability Platform, trying to get published, publicly available data on our UK livestock production systems is a nightmare. We have no central systems that can gather this and make it easy for us to show where we are and how we get there. So I hope that's given you just a little flavour of some of the challenges that we look at and that we hear and experience as a processor, and where we could go further maybe in our approaches to building that knowledge capacity to help us get to net zero. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. That's great. A really fascinating insight into the supplier side as well, and I think complements the other two speakers. So we've had a good look from every perspective, from advisors and the AKIS and from farmers, and also the supply chain. Got a few questions in the chat here. Let's have a look. The first one's about research. Somebody has been looking for peer-reviewed papers to demonstrate the economic case for sustainable farming practices that prove short-term gains to farming business. Are you aware of any research developing that does that? So maybe that's a question more for researchers on the call today. Perhaps if you can't answer immediately, you could put some links in the chat if anything occurs to you. We don't have any hands up yet.
I mean, I can add, I haven't got an answer for you, I'm afraid, Imogen, but I think it's a really good point. I think a lot of the research to date tends to be US focused rather than UK, but also longer term, because it's usually around improving levels of soil organic matter and soil carbon. So obviously there are fewer, to my knowledge, sort of studies and particular peer-reviewed papers that are UK specific, but also, like say, tackle the shorter term gains. So I don't know of any, but I think it's a really valid point and a valid gap. And I think sometimes it's always just as important to call out the research gaps as it is in terms of that. So I feel like I've just given you a bit of a politician's answer, but hopefully that helps a bit.
If I can just come in there, that might help as well, in that I've not looked very recently, but certainly the Centre for Innovation Excellence in Livestock have got some very useful summaries that have ideas or show the impact of different measures that people could take on farm and the likely cost or how hard or easy they are to implement as a starting point, but certainly more in-depth work on that. But the key is, as we were saying earlier, is tailoring the right advice to the farm. So there will be some things that they can achieve and some things that are just impossible no matter how much they try. And it's finding some of those, well, certainly finding the quick wins, but also if there is a longer term gain. I mean, I could give an example. I used to do a lot of work with Charlie Morgan, Glassmaster, and talking about, you know, if the soil pH isn't right, you're not going to get the yield and the soil health from that soil. But a farmer would rather give the animals some extra feed for a few £100 than pay the few £100 for liming. And the liming would give the longer term benefit. And this is one of the challenges we have, certainly on the livestock sector, is being able to see the return on the investment quickly enough for them to have the confidence and keep going with things. So there we are. I don't know whether that helped, but that was just my thought.
I think we're also guilty, I'm just zooming out a bit, of talking about transformative changes all the time. And actually, sometimes it is the small wins, incremental wins, that can build up that picture over time. There are theories of, I think it's a theory of small wins. So it's a portfolio approach that you might be able to do some big transformable systemic changes, but also it's that, you know, that day-to-day incremental change as well that I think is important, needs to be monitored and evidenced. What have we got here? 2 questions from Louise. What are the reasons for farmers who've signed up to the carbon literacy course wanting to take it? Brady or Sarah would like to answer that one. Was it their own interest, or did they see an advert for Nature Markets carbon credits because their advisors told them about it, or was it a retailer? Perhaps that answer the first question first.
Yeah, I can jump in. Yeah, I think just like with any kind of climate change action sort of initiatives, you tend to get the kind of people who are switched on and more keen and perhaps more knowledgeable, who are the kind of early people who will sign up to the training course. So I don't think we've seen anyone who would have these kind of motivations of kind of carbon credits being told to do so. They are genuinely keen to learn, you know, to just get a really good understanding and grasp on climate change and just be able to also communicate on climate change with their peers. Yeah, and so we offer both kind of open cohorts where people can just sign up to this kind of open cohort, and then just, you know, you kind of pay per person for the training course. I don't think we've had many farmers on these open cohorts to date, so it's probably not a lot to say about. I think on the second question, what has tended to surprise farmers who have completed the course, such as myths and kind of things that they found weren't true. So we haven't had a lot of farmers on the open cohorts. We've had farmers on cohorts that we've delivered for organizations who basically just, you know, paid for kind of a closed cohort, and then we would have farmers as part of that cohort because they've decided they, you know, as we've spoken about today, needs to be part of these discussions and part of the training delivery. On the kind of myths and stuff, I would say what I particularly value about the carbon literacy training as such is that, you know, it's not delivered to fight with people and argue, oh no, you're not right, this is not true, this is not how it is. What we tend to do is we actually, you know, accept people's positions, people's understanding of climate change. We obviously give them the facts and data. However, we will make sure that we focus on the co-benefits of climate change actions. So we look at the economic benefits of actions, you know, the kind of creation of new kind of green jobs, upskilling, you know, benefits for, you know, transport infrastructure. So we kind of make sure that we touch on co-benefits so that it's not just about, you know, reduce carbon, because we're like really aware of, you know, not everyone sees it as a #1 priority for many very good reasons.
Thank you. There's a bit of discussion there helping out Imogen, but there's a question here for Julie. Does Keep Ag offer farmers any financial incentives to take action to decarbonise, or any other support?
Okay. At the moment, we have very little resource available for that unless one of our customers has got a particular interest in area and is willing to provide a bonus for animals that meet a particular specification. We can then pass that on to them. We do have a scheme at the moment that's looking at Aberdeen Angus cattle, but that's sort of breed specific in that respect. So it's a very tight margin in processing at the moment, and so we would love to be able to offer more incentives to farmers for that, but unless the customer's willing to pay, it makes it very hard, and especially because there's no one customer that takes the whole carcass. They don't take the whole animal. So if you pay a premium for a whole animal, you've paid a lot of money for the offal, for all of the other parts that actually probably wouldn't get a higher return from a customer as well, which makes balancing the books on that extremely tight. We do rely very much on the customers themselves putting their hand in their pocket and passing some of that money down.
That's interesting. So is the incentive for farmers then that they get access to those customers through you, access to the market?
They would get access to those customers through us, yes.
Yeah. But if they didn't meet certain standards, then they wouldn't.
They wouldn't get the same level of price for those animals, yeah.
Okay. Some interesting points raised. In a livestock context, many farmers feel the social pressure and climate given emission data. Could this be helped by a refocus of research? This is about being told how much cattle emit, but getting data on carbon uptake as well. Does anybody want to comment on that? It's about soils, grassland, arable soils, and so on.
Yeah, I can take that one, Julie. I think that's a really valid point, and it probably goes back to that myth about, sort of net zero meaning zero emissions, but actually it's about the balance. So never want to miss an opportunity to plug, but hopefully you're all aware of AHDB's environmental baselining pilots. So, a complete forward-thinking pilot across 170 farms across the UK, looking at measuring both below and above ground green carbon sequestration and carbon storage at the same time. And again, it's that very thing, Nick. It's about starting to really develop the conversation and develop our evidence base in terms of actually looking at the whole picture. So the baselining pilot, this is the beginning of this whole conversation. We need a lot more research in terms of really understanding this space more. But I completely agree. And I think that's when we can, expect to see increased engagement, because it feels more fair, it feels more balanced, and also at the end of the day, is we all want the same thing. It's just about how we get there. And I think the idea is that it will give us the complete sort of picture. Then whether it's what we want to see or not is another thing, but actually we'll know where we are. We'll have that baseline, and exactly we can see actually that things can be a bit more balanced.
Thank you. I had a question. It was about the language, because this has cropped up in lots of conversations, and I was thinking about where the responsibility lies. I mean, just today we're guilty as researchers talking about net zero, being climate smart, talking about AKIS, all these concepts, and then people in your position will have your own language, and then the farming community will have their language as well. So where does the responsibility lie to try and get this common language, or this meaningful language sorted? That's a big question, I know.
I mean, I can start us off, since I sort of trundled on about sort of farmer-friendly language, but I honestly think the language responsibility sits with us all. It's all using appropriate language. It's understanding that actually our sort of trajectory to net zero affects us all, whether we're farming or we're not. And I think it's important to all of us that we reach our goals and that we really progress. So I think there's a responsibility for all of us. I do think in terms of levy boards, I think we play a really important role in terms of bridging the gap between research and farmers. And I think, that the language we use is really quite key. And obviously we're also communicating with different audiences, from farmers to consumers to industry stakeholders. So we have to adapt our language. So I do think it's for all of us, but I think we probably all have different roles as well in terms of that language.
Anybody else? Thoughts on that? I just wanted to expand on the concept of literacy as well, because I think for us it's not a top-down concept of just skills and knowledge. It's much more about something that's embedded, and it's the process of seeking out and evaluating and interpreting and applying knowledge. So I didn't want to give the impression using this term literacy that it's very much about teaching. It's far beyond that. It's much more of a looking at it in a social context. I expect, everybody here is using it in that context as well, but I just wanted to clarify that. Okay, another question here for Julie. Is there anything that can be done to help address the carcass balance issue that might make it harder to design beef and sheep supply chain sustainability incentives?
It would make it even harder than it is at the moment, you mean?
Did you want to elaborate on that, Louise?
Well, I'll go on. Oh, she did mean easier. That's all right.
Sorry. Yes. Yeah.
That's okay. Well, it's interesting because at the end of the day, most of the populations that eat the cuts of meat that we don't eat in the UK are much further afield. They're those lucrative export type markets, and they come at a cost as well. I know that Meat Promotion Wales are doing a lot of work at the moment to try and look at the nutrient value of offal, like liver and others, to try and encourage more people to eat those. But until they become as sought after in a restaurant or at home as a prime steak or a lamb's leg or whatever, it's going to be very hard to overcome the public perception of some of these other cuts of meat that just don't return the same value. So we can look at those lucrative markets. In fairness, we do a lot of work with AHDB and others to try and develop those export markets and to try and achieve that return that would make it easier. But how that would translate through to sustainability then is a bit more of a challenge, because all of the animal is produced from the sustainable sort of practices on farm. And so it's very much the secondary processing and sale of that we do sort of, whenever we're communicating with those export markets, we do promote very much the sustainability story that goes with UK livestock production. And again, this is where the data and the story will all help us to help each other in this respect. So I don't know whether that's fully answered the question, Louise, but
no, it has. No, that's really interesting, very complicated as well. So no, thank you for answering that.
I've got a question for Brady about the AKIS review you did for Scotland. Are there any particular areas that you feel need to be especially strengthened when it comes to net zero capacities? Is it the advisory community, or are there other areas that equally need to be strengthened or don't have those sufficient knowledges?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the thing that we came across again and again was the need for facilitation. So it's really like, it's a key skill set that's not always present in, or not necessarily, like it's its own set of skills to bring people together and to like we're talking about, to defuse language, to set the scene, to to create the space where people feel safe to talk and share and learn. And having an advisor, you're a perfect advisor that knows all about the research and knows has an intimate understanding of farm enterprises, might still not have those key skills. So it's learning, it's getting people, and the other interesting thing about it is those people don't necessarily need to have that detailed knowledge of both spaces either. It's like they can actually just be facilitators and just be skilled at sort of bringing people together in that way, and those sorts of tactics. And yeah, so I think that's a key one that kept cropping up, was investing in those sorts of roles. And that'll be important. They're like kind of the glue that could make it all work together and run.
Mm-hmm. And would help lots of other areas as well, the other topic areas, I mean. Yeah. Any other questions? You'd like a comment from Heather? Yeah. James, go ahead.
Sorry, I've just been listening to that last discussion, and I wanted to add a bit, because one of the we years ago did a piece of work for DEFRA on integrated advice, and we seem to be returning to a familiar discussion. And I think the skill set that I see that is not fully available as much is a variant on facilitators, but it's actually people to integrate and balance different decisions based on the problem that the individual farm or land manager is facing. And there is a difference between very good specialists and people who can integrate. And if I can just make a plug, that's one of the things we're trying to do in the viability indicator, is to at least present the balance of benefits, disbenefits, and things in one place, without saying this is what you must do everywhere, because most situations are unique, and the individual challenges or aspirations of the land manager are actually what really have to be determined.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Have you got any examples of where that's worked well, or any particular advisors who are good at this?
Well, in a way, that's what an agronomist does on farm, but they're probably not as familiar with some of the reducing emissions discussions as they should be, but they do that with balancing how you control pests or weeds, and a vet will do the same. But again, some of the emissions discussion is lacking from some of the background. We too run carbon literacy training, and I'm pleased that that sort of training is taking place, because that is a really important way of opening people's eyes to but none of this is straightforward. I've had discussions with in the Lunds project with people on the call downs in policy divisions, and they're after very definitive numbers. The trouble is it varies year on year, season on season, site to site, and it's quite a challenge when people think they can just get a number and model something, which is why on the indicator we've been quite, I just want to know whether it's very large or very small or negative in the wrong direction, and get people to focus on actually being able to move forward in a relatively straightforward way, and recognize some of the barriers they will face along the way, because there may be a cost, but it might be a short-term capital cost that could be offset by a grant rather than ongoing annual costs, which is why we've separated those two.
Thank you. Yeah, I see Rachel nodding.
Just to piggyback on what James just said, I think that was a really good comment, and I think that's that's what where I particularly think that there's high value in courses like carbon literacy, because it really does allow you to kind of level the playing field. So it gives a really, really good basic understanding to everyone who needs to be involved, and then that kind of helps you manage the expectations, and so that people do not expect these kind of precise figures. They do not expect precise numbers, and they understand that that is not possible, but also that is not the goal, and that way you also avoid a lot of confusions. You also avoid people perhaps believing a lot of myths around climate change, and it really is kind of like the ground, kind of the basic stone for building on. Then your facilitation comes in place, I guess, and then obviously kind of wider networking with researchers and evidence based kind of approach.
Thank you. Yeah. One thought I had as well is, are we not recognising or rewarding farmers who are already doing very good mitigation practices but just can't evidence it? Well, they haven't got the data, or they're not part of the system. So is there a risk that those that are actually, going ahead and doing things sometimes are just not recognised? And how do we counter that?
I think that's a good point, Julie, actually. And I suppose it's that debate, isn't it, in between sort of actions and outcomes sometimes, that I know we could go around all day discussing about, but I think you're absolutely right. And, my big thing is, I don't think I know any farmers who get up in the morning and think, oh, I'm going to go and release some greenhouse gas emissions today. I think everybody, you get it with good intention, and actually, there's some real sort of forward-thinking farmers who've been on this trajectory for a long time because they've seen the benefits, they've seen those win-wins, and I think you're right. We're at real risk of disengaging them as well, because they perhaps can't demonstrate that additional action or that change, and like you say, they don't necessarily have the data from the starting point. So I think it's a good point. I think what it does is it flags perhaps the different levels of language and sort of guidance and support in this area, from a bit like James said, the fact that your sort of emissions can change year on year, purely because of, we're harnessing natural resources. It might get a wet year and it's rubbish in terms of yield, but we might get a good year and vice versa. So I think it's understanding we need to accommodate actually quite a lot of different individuals as well here.
Julie?
Sorry, I was just going to reinforce what Rachel was saying then, in terms of it's those farmers that have achieved so much over a number of years. At the moment, a lot of schemes and others are rewarding progress for further change. Well, if the scope on their farm doesn't have that, I've been trying to encourage sort of policymakers and customers alike to at least reward the farmers for maintaining the levels that they've got, and at least, keeping that, because otherwise, if we're talking about soils and carbon and what have you, it'd be so much easier to just go and plough my grassland up, start from nothing, and then get in all this grant support to put it right, which sort of really defeats the object. So it's how we can try and understand, even if we can't have data to prove it, how we can almost map the journey that farm's been on over a number of years. I mean, somebody we deal with very regularly hasn't ploughed for 20 years. And yes, this particular farmer is very data driven, but he probably wouldn't have the kind of data 20 years ago to come up with an empirical number. But nevertheless, the journey that he's been on and the observations and the changes he's seen on his farm and his production tell a very good story. And if there's any way of us harnessing some of that, would help, and that would help overcome this whole notion that everybody's being beaten up by this and nobody's actually being rewarded for they've invested a fortune over the last 10 or 20 years of their time and their effort. They've not got there necessarily easily, but it feels like nobody's actually listening or rewarding that kind of work. So it is interesting for those who've already made significant progress. It's almost like we need to target the different audiences, those that have got an opportunity to improve, and how do we look after those who've already achieved something fairly special.
I think that's key, isn't it? It's that maintenance of the early adopters, because what we don't want to do is we see a sort of a regression because they feel that. So I think you're absolutely right, Julian. I'd never thought about those different farmer audiences as well. It's really key that it goes back to that point about things being bespoke and targeted and what works with that particular farmer and that particular landscape as well.
With these carbon literacy courses, is there an alignment between them in the land use sector? Is there do you compare curricula, or is there an umbrella organisation for accreditation? I'm just wondering what the whether there's a risk of inconsistency or the opposite.
So it's an organization called Carbon Literacy Project that's based in Manchester, and basically their kind of aim was to kind of create this low carbon culture across society, and they kind of set the criteria of what a carbon literacy course needs to have in its content, and then basically we've taken those criteria but made it specific to land use, agriculture, farming. It's as I said, it's kind of basic level information. So we don't go into as much detail to kind of create any conflict between kind of information being taught, in kind of formal education system. I don't think it's more just the understanding of the kind of carbon flows in agriculture, in different agricultural systems. Not necessarily saying this is wrong, this is good, and this is how you need to do everything, but just this is how it works in nature. And now you as a farmer take that information and you figure out what it means for your farm.
Yeah,
I would say. Or you as an advisor, I guess, in most cases.
Great. I don't think I've missed anything in the chat. There's various comments and suggestions. Thanks, James, for that. And there's a link to the viability tool that James mentioned as well further up, which is being developed in the Lunds Hub. Any other questions, anybody? Any burning questions? We have our experts here. Question about what is a trusted advisor in the context of climate adaptation? Yes, we do. You tend to use that term very loosely, don't we? Trust. It crops up the whole time, but it's a bit amorphous and it means different things to different people. Anybody want to have a stab at that?
Sorry, my fault. I tried to drop out of the discussion for quite a bit. But
you just lobbed a grenade in and then stepped back.
But yeah. I'm just thinking, we know about trusted advisors, but most of the case they're people who have offered advice for a farm for a long period of time. Yeah. And that's largely about normal things that they do. 98% of the decisions are just a tweak on what they did last year. Where it strikes me that climate change is something so different. How do you get that trusted notion? Because most of the evidence around trusted is that they've been in contact with you as as an advisor and land manager relationship over a long period of time. And this is something very different. So I just wondered what your thoughts on that were.
They haven't had the time to build up that credibility.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think it's a challenge, isn't it, this, because it's credibility, I think a bit like we discussed earlier in terms of agricultural knowledge and knowing that particular farm, but also credibility in terms of knowing the mitigation and adaptation space as well. I mean, this is probably my biggest concern. There are a few that know me on this call and do drone on about this quite a lot, but my biggest concern going forward is around advice in terms of really good, accurate, constructive and practical on-farm advice. Again, I don't feel like I'm answering your question, Chris, but I think it's something that we really probably as an industry need to discuss more. Obviously, we just had a chat about in terms of consistency, and that's really key so that we're all on the same page. But certainly probably more accreditations around training, I think it is really quite fundamental. But I see that this is probably a risk, but also an opportunity going forward to really perhaps enhance this space more.
There's a risk of signposting someone if you don't feel you're skilled to do that. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, it's quite, where we stand today, this is a really specific skill set. It is quite challenging to be able to straddle both and I think straddle both, but also in quite an evidence data driven way. I think that's really key, and that's, for me, that's where you become more trusted then in terms of doing it based on evidence. But yeah, no, it's gonna be a challenge, I think.
Hugh.
Yeah, hi everyone. Just a couple of comments really, based on my experience over the course of the last 15 years or so working with farmers around mitigation, and also from an inventory perspective, I suppose. One of the things that strikes me is that we talk about mitigation and adaptation as they are some sort of separate component of a farming system, and they are not that. They are effectively things that integrate with what farmers do on a day in, day out. And talking about Rachel's very well articulated some of the communication challenges we have. We've got to stop talking so much about things that sit separately from a farming system and talk about things that integrate with farming systems. And I suppose leading on from that point, I don't think we've got very good tools that contextualize the way that emissions are today. And we tend to look at the outputs of a greenhouse gas emissions calculation as somehow that's a route to understanding why the emissions are the way that they are. But the fact is, you've really got to drill into the primary activity data in a lot of detail to really understand what's happening on that farm and what needs to be done or what should be done, or whether the emissions are high for a particular reason within a short window of time, or whether the system.
Oh, frozen. Lost you there, Hugh. You've broken up.
Sorry, I just dropped out.
No, that's okay. You're back again.
Sorry. So I was basically saying that we try to retrofit inventories to a farm scale, and they don't really fit within a 12-month window of observation. We need to take a more systems-based approach. If we look at beef's a brilliant example of a multi-annual production system that we try and fit into a 12-month window of observation and develop a greenhouse gas emissions footprint for. It doesn't work very well at all. And we need to try and understand far better what that system looks like over a multiples of years, in terms of what their fertility looks like, what their nutritional use efficiency looks like, and so on and so on. So we've got to try and think more about the system and the context, and just maybe put to one side what comes out of a carbon footprint and understand more about what is going into them from an activity data perspective.
Great comment, thank you. Right, I think these are all goodbyes here. Yeah. Any final comments? We've got 3 minutes left. It's probably time that we wrapped up, unless any of our speakers want to just summarise with one key point that they want us all to take home. But that's a bit unfair launching that at you. But I think we've had a really fascinating conversation. So thank you for your contributions, and particularly to the 3 speakers. So if we want to show our appreciation. Chris?
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for your time and input. And please do follow up if you have any questions about the Lunds Hub or about this particular topic area. It would be great to hear from you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks all.